Hi, I'm Dr. Bevin Campbell, and today I'm speaking with Dr. Kirk Schneider as part of a series of conversations produced by the Psychotherapy Action Network, a global community of mental health professionals and stakeholders dedicated to promoting psychotherapies of depth, insight, and relationship. In this series, we'll be speaking to authors, researchers, academics, and policymakers, many of whom serve as advisors to the Psychotherapy Action Network and all of whom are concerned about the state of mental health care policies and practices. We will be hearing what some important voices in our field have to say about the future of psychotherapy. As I said, today I'm speaking with Kirk Schneider, and very happy to be doing so. He's a licensed psychologist and a leading spokesperson for contemporary existential-humanistic and existential-integrative psychology. Dr. Schneider is a co-founder and current president of the Existential-Humanistic Institute, an award-winning psychotherapy training center, council member and candidate for president of the American Psychological Association, past president for the Society for Humanistic Psychology, Division 32 of the APA, recent past editor of the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, a trained moderator for the conflict mediation group Braver Angels, and an adjunct faculty member at Saybrook University and Teachers College, Columbia University. He received the Rollo May Award for outstanding and independent contributions to the field of humanistic psychology from the Society for Humanistic Psychology of the APA and is a fellow of 5 APA divisions. Dr. Schneider has published over 200 articles, interviews, and chapters, and has authored or edited 13 books, including The Spirituality of Awe, The Polarized Mind, Awakening to Awe, The Handbook of Humanistic Psychology, Existential-Humanistic Therapy, Existential-Integrative Psychotherapy, The Wiley World Handbook of Existential Therapy, and The Depolarizing of America, a guidebook for social healing. Dr. Schneider's work has been featured in Scientific America, The New York Times, The Guardian, Vanity Fair, Psychology Today, and many other health and psychology outlets. Kirk, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Bevin.
So I was introduced to you and your work through your campaign for APA president, and I wanted to start there by asking what inspired your run, and maybe if you could say a little bit about your vision for the organization.
Absolutely. Well, what inspired my run was pure serendipity, really. One May evening, I got a call from an ex-president of the APA letting me know that I'd been nominated to run for APA president. So it really dropped out of the blue. I had been a council member for APA for, I don't know, a year and a half. And I've been involved in APA politics for a while. But when that invitation came, it struck me as a kind of, as Paul Tillich might put it, a kairos, both a bit of a crisis and an opportunity. So after talking with my family, I decided to jump in. And also, really, I think the main driver for me was to get a more depth and holistic perspective on psychology out there to the broader APA and also to our society, because I feel very strongly, and I have for a long time, about the riches of depth existential psychotherapy and psychology and integrative psychology and psychotherapy.
Yeah, when I read about your platform, one of the things that really was interesting about it was this idea you talked about that psychologists have more to offer outside of our individual work with patients who come to see us, and that in a way we could really be deployed to address some of these, existential issues that we're facing, and in particular, the polarization of the country that gets in the way of us addressing, the many threats that we're under right now. Right. So could you tell me a little bit about how you envision psychologists, being deployed in that way? What would we be able to do?
Yes, and this really speaks to my platform for running for APA president. I would say, firstly, it's about transforming psychology from being a secondary national priority to being a primary national priority. And I think that's especially relevant now with all the psychological, psychosocial crises around us. And I would advocate this through three basic ways. First are healing dialogues. As you mentioned, I'm a trained moderator for Braver Angels, which is a grassroots citizens organization. It's been around for about 4 or 5 years at the eve of the election of our last president. And basically was developed by a psychologist, Bill Doherty, to attempt to bring self-identified liberals and conservatives together for living room style dialogues. And a lot of principles of humanistic psychology and marriage and family psychology were brought to bear to facilitate this. And it's been a fascinating venture. I've been a part of that group for about 4 years now. And we have our own monthly alliance group, our own group. We've been meeting, monthly, and we take on pretty tough issues, political issues, and really the format of the group is aimed at helping people to understand and learn about each other, as opposed to stereotype and presume things about the other, which often devolves very quickly into flame throwing and devaluation. And through that understanding and learning about each other, enhancing the likelihood of some common ground. Because as we fill out more of the humanity of each other, and vulnerability of being more fully present to each other, we find connections. And I've been really astonished by some of the shifts that I've seen and felt, both in myself and others, in those workshops and in our monthly alliance group. Just seeing each other more as human beings rather than labels is so valuable. And so I've drawn on that, as well as about 15 years of cultivating an approach that I call the experiential democracy dialogue, which is a one-on-one meeting between people of very contrasting backgrounds. Could be liberal conservative, could be black, white, religious, ethnic differences. But it definitely parallels my Braver Angels work. And as I say, it draws some from that. It's a kind of synthesis of that, but the Braver Angels work is more of a group dialogue format. So I see this as really a more intimate and experiential connection between two people from very different camps, so to speak. And I find it to be a very powerful complement to the more group-oriented dialogue of Braver Angels. In fact, I've been bringing it into that arena, to some degree. I've been beginning to bring that in. But I've also been doing a number of webinars on the experiential democracy dialogue. I'm trying to bring it out to broader audiences and also within the psychology audience. And I recently wrote a book that summarizes my experience with these dialogue groups. As you mentioned, The Depolarizing of America, a guidebook for social healing. And really what I'm trying to do with that book and with these webinars is to give away the tools that I feel I've been so privileged to be able to cultivate over the years. And I present a 6-phase approach that is basically about helping people to become more present to the other in themselves, as well as the other being the partner that they're working with, who's on, the other ideological or cultural side, if you will. And I think, they both very much go together. So, for example, the first phase involves a visualization before even beginning a dialogue with a partner, of just visualizing what it might be like to sit with that other person, what kind of feelings, even body sensations, associations come up as you sense that, and to try to see it in a mindful way, try not to get attached to any particular reaction that you have, and then see if you can clear a space for the human being that's there for you, the person with a personal story. So it's beginning the groundwork for actually discussing issues. I mean, the second phase is having the respective partners talk about what it was like for them to grow up. Context is so important in these cases. So anyway, that is a major advocacy point for me, both in terms of APA, in with regard to the wide range of divisions that we have within APA, and bringing those divisions together would be one of my plans, or the leaders of those divisions, to engage in these kinds of dialogues in regard to theoretical camps, because, as you know, there's a lot of stereotyping and presumption about, quantitative, qualitative research, psychodynamic and cognitive behavioral therapy, humanistic, and more programmatic, either cognitive behavioral or medical kinds of approaches, et cetera, et cetera. So I could see it as very valuable within our profession, but I'd say most importantly in terms of the society, and I would want to recruit as many psychologists as possible to become facilitators of these kinds of dialogue groups for the many people struggling with vision. And also it's an attempt to address divisiveness in a wide range of places in our society. I think this is one of the major problems that we face. It's in our households, for example. So giving these skills away to parents and their children, or parents who feel divided ideologically, let's say, within communities. We've applied it to police officers and community activists, for example. I have an example on YouTube of a white police officer working with a Black community activist. It could be applied in classrooms with students who are on different sides of, let's say, an ideological or cultural issue. In the work setting, and maybe most importantly in the legislative setting, where people actually have the weight of our lives in their hands, and major, huge decisions, like about going to war or economic issues.
Are you finding people are hungry for these kind of conversations? What are people receptive to it? Is there a lot of resistance?
I'm finding more and more receptivity. I think it's a kind of a new concept for a number of people, and especially on a mass scale. I think that's something that is that people are beginning to open up to and see a great value to. But but the idea of people actually sitting with one another on very different sides and being more present to themselves and others is, even though it may be pretty familiar to those of us in the depth psychology community, is quite a radical concept for
it is
for business as usual, right? In our quick fix, instant results society. So that's part of what I'm up against there.
It makes me, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I just mentioned quickly that a third piece here, or second piece to the platform, is advocating for a psychological consultant to the United States. Also called it the Psychologist General, did a Scientific American article about it. And I'm advocating for a task force at Council, an APA task force, to look into the merit of calling on Congress to create such an office. Because I really think that we need a position in government that focuses specifically on psychosocial approaches to mental health care. Right now, though there are a number of positions within the Surgeon General's office and substance abuse and mental health administration under HHS with psychologists and psychology, but they tend to be under the umbrella of medical folks. And I think we've been long dominated by medicine and psychiatry in those upper levels. And while I think that they have done a really tremendous job at a lot of levels in elevating the mental health in our country, it's obvious to me and many others that we have a long way to go. And we've got major mental health crises within government, as well as in terms of anxiety, depression, addiction, bigotry, suicidality, et cetera. And so to have an office and a figurehead directly in government that could streamline the wealth of psychological data that we have and act as an advisor, to the president, to the Congress, to the public about latest findings from a holistic, integrative psychological view, I think would be enormously beneficial, especially at this time where there's so many breakdowns in the well-being of our culture and the leadership of our culture.
Right. When you describe, and I've seen some of the videos you've done, with the experiential democracy dialogues, and when I hear about your work with Braver Angels, one thing it makes me think is, so I'm a psychologist, and when I'm with a patient, it's not hard at all for me to know that the direction I should be going in is towards maximal openness, receptivity, and curiosity. And so even if I inevitably fail in that task, I understand that is my job here, to go in that direction.
Yes.
And I find for myself, at the end of my workday, when I'm just logging onto Twitter, I no longer have that same striving. And you seem like someone who's really taken that therapeutic stance with you in a way into the world. And I wonder how you've gotten there, because I assume it's been a journey.
No question about it. Well, I feel very blessed that from a very young age, I had the support and understanding that was so critical for me. When I was about 2.5 years old, I lost my brother. My family lost my brother to a combination of chicken pox that attacked his heart and pneumonia. This was in the late 50s. He was 7 years old. I was close to 3. And as you can imagine, it shattered my family, me. I was probably a particularly sensitive kid anyway. but my parents were, in extremely deep grieving and struggle with this whole thing, in particular my mother. But the really wonderful side of that is that they were both very psychologically attuned. My father was a high school teacher, math and science teacher, but also very tuned into psychology on kids. And he eventually did his dissertation on creativity in kids. And so he was highly encouraging of that for me. And my mother is an amazing woman. She actually went into psychoanalysis, and this is in the early 60s. And she also became a leading spokesperson for television and radio in Cleveland area, which was obviously very unique for a young woman at that time. And but she had that very deep attunement, and I was in very bad shape as about a 4 and 5 year old kid. Had a lot of temper tantrums and fears, nightmares, and I was very sad. I was especially very afraid of death, understandable. And she referred me through her analyst to a child analyst. I was about 5, I think it was 5 years old. And that was probably one of the 2 or 3 most important contacts I've had in my life. And I can't tell you, in content so much why that was. I don't remember actual words that were exchanged. I don't think we did a lot of play therapy, but I do remember just his presence. He was a very seasoned analyst. And I think he worked with Anna Freud too, actually. But I had the feeling, even at that young age, that this guy had been through it himself. And that was a lot of, I think, what came through to me, and a feeling of safety out of that he could hold me in all my craziness, it felt like, my terrors. And he had such a loving yet firm way of holding me in that relation. So that was really my beginning on the road to psychology. And I would say my introduction to existentialism really was, I kind of am fond of saying that I had my midlife crisis at 2.5. My world shattered, the familiar and routine fabric of living was just ripped open by the hole that was left in the wake of my brother's death.
Right.
Anyway, gradually I was able to move from a position of really paralyzing terror and a kind of constriction to gradual intrigue, risk-taking, and probably with my analyst as well, and as far as just disclosing with him, and eventual, kind of wonder and amazement at the big questions of living,
You just reminded me when you were saying that to be open to someone else, to be curious about them, to as you put it, to see the other in yourself and yourself in the other. It is a risk, right? Like it comes with anxieties. The more our histories have trauma and terror in them, I think it is harder for us to be willing to take that risk. Since you brought up existentialism, I wondered if I could ask you, I know that your work is really grounded in humanistic and existential theories. And back when I was in graduate school, so this has been about a decade now, I really had unfortunately, so little exposure to these theories and ways of working. And in case that's true for anyone watching, I wanted to see if you could say a little bit about humanistic and existential psychology. And in particular, I know you've developed existential-integrative psychotherapy.
Yes.
Can you tell me, so what might I experience as a patient working with someone who took one of these positions?
Well, the main focus, as I view it, of existential humanistic and existential integrative therapy is, how are you presently living? So clearing a space, supporting a space for you to check in and connect with how are you living right now? What is your life like? What are the parameters of your life? What are the main battles you're experiencing? How are you doing with those? And then the second question, which I think naturally follows from it, is then how are you willing to live? So these questions really play on classic themes in existential humanistic therapy of freedom and responsibility. So providing conditions, co-creating conditions where you have the freedom to sort of roam within and explore how are you presently living, and then the freedom to look at how are you willing to live, what choices are you willing to make based on how you're living, and also the responsibility. So it's one thing to want certain things, to feel blocked in certain ways, and to want to break through. I think I see that often as people's battles. It's something attempting to break through and liberate them. Let's say liberate them toward being able to love someone more, or to create something that is deeply meaningful to them, or to pursue some form of work or some cause perhaps, or just to live a more settled life. So something attempting to break through, and then there's something often based on trauma that is blocking that. So that's the tension of the battle. And so the question of having freedom to explore these stuck places, but also the responsibility, the ability to respond to where you are stuck, how you are stuck, and what is attempting to break through. And so I see the EH and EI, existential, humanistic, existential, integrative approaches as facilitating a series of both active and passive mirrors to clients, so that you see closer and closer up both what's attempting to break through within yourself and what's stopping you. And it often takes many revisitations to that battle, right? Before you're clear about what you're really up against, the roots of that, and then clearer and clearer about what's mobilizing to overcome that, to break out of it. And so that's what I see often in the culminating phase of the work, is person getting to the place where they're not going to take it anymore. They've seen over and over how, they're trying to feel more free in their lives, let's say, to pursue the kind of work that really interests them, whereas they've been accepting something very shortchanging. And it's partly a kind of frustration that's building up, or what Otto Rank would call counter will. Because every time it comes up, there's more and more intensity about and pain about being stuck there. And of course, this is part of the art of it, of modulating that mirror from the genuine place or instrument of that therapist to help people kind of go at their own pace, or the pace they're capable of. But it's a building process that hopefully and optimally culminates in seeing so close up both what's trying to break through and what's stopping them, that they're finally able to break through to pursuing that particular goal or meaning in their lives. And I would go so far as to say, and what I've been bringing into the perspective more and more, is cultivating a sense of awe toward living. It's not just about, at least for some people who are willing and able to go deeper into their life possibilities, not just about pursuing one goal or meaning per se, but a whole new attitude toward living. An attitude of humility, because the person has been deeply humbled. We've often been crushed when we're in psychotherapy, and I mean before, what led up to it, but you learn to be more present to your smallness, your fragility, your imperceptibility sometimes, but also your capacity to reach out, to take some risks, with your therapist in the moment, and hopefully outside. So there's an emboldening aspect as well. So in a real sense, this kind of depth integrative approach forms a staging ground for cultivation of the sense of awe toward life itself, a humility and a wonder toward living. You have a much greater freedom to range within, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will. You can stay with your most dreaded fears and anxieties, as well as your capacity to be more than those dreads and anxieties, to come into the more of who you are and the more of life. And through that, I really think it's a kind of lifting to a larger perspective on living. And that's a lot of, I think, and feel where my curiosity and wonder comes from. I've had the great gift, and this is partly why I'm such a crusader for, depth-oriented integrative therapy, is because I've learned it and lived it myself, always evolving in it. But what greater gift is there than to feel free to experience the fullness of the gift of life, possibilities, and noticing, being able to notice so much more from your everyday walks or moments with, your lover or your children or what have you, your work, to maybe something that is particularly grand, a project or a cause that you have. But this is something that's I think what's so great about that kind of transformation is it's wide ranging and it's deep. It's not confined to just exteriors. And that, I think, is a major problem with our general orientation in contemporary psychology, is we are focused so much on exteriors.
I don't think you said this directly, but one thing I took from what you're saying is that one potential way we learn to offer that presence to ourselves is through the relationship with a therapist who can be and remain present for these intimate struggles that we need to engage in, these intimate conflicts. Has that been your experience?
That's directly my experience. And I've again been very blessed to have two wonderful therapists. I've had several therapists over my life. They were all decent, but I've had two standout therapists. The one I described earlier, and then the second one when I was in graduate school, that I had some reactivation of my earlier trauma, and also the divorce of my parents when I was young also, which I didn't get into. But I was in some scary shape there. I had a wonderful experience in my graduate years, but I had a professor that I idolized a lot, and he challenged me to work at the local mental hospital. And that, in combination with my father visiting me with his new girlfriend, and who was almost my age, and just kind of a convergence of events really threw me off into some old and new fears, terrors. And I think, that idea of working with, quote, craziness, or the unmoored, the groundless, really came back for me. And so I found, actually through a blind student, this is like Teresa's in Oedipus, Rex, the blind seer, wonderful young woman in my class who said two things that were pivotal to me. One was, "This too shall pass." And there was something really powerful about her saying that in particular. I instinctively went to her. I had this sort of breakdown. And then the second was, I know of a person that I think can be really helpful to you. And that was a woman named Gustin, and this was at my school in Georgia. And she was an existential analyst. She had trained in both areas. And the most important learning, just aside from the great humanity of that relationship and a kind of reparenting in some fundamental ways, was to stay present, to stay with whatever it was that was coming up. And of course, that was a process over time. It wasn't that long, it was just a little less than a year. But that's a lot of what I practiced with her, very live. And the live aspect, the here and now aspect, is very important. The experiential aspect, very important. It wasn't so much about words, again, much more about staying with the sort of pre-verbal kinesthetic sensibilities that were coming up in my concern or struggle. And her providing a space for that, a support for that, and encouraging me to take that out into the world, where I'd have anxiety attacks at times, panic attacks. And it really, I think, was life-changing for me. Because, it made me feel a certain confidence that I had not ever before felt in my life, because I was able to somehow stay with these fuller ranges of impulses and experiences myself, that I wasn't as burdened by them. I knew, what I'd been through in the therapy, in my life. She also emphasized what I had survived and overcome. And that was powerful as a touchstone. And I also had some, quite challenging experiences with existence overall. And that's something we haven't gotten into. I don't know if we'll have time, but I think one of the distinctions between a kind of existential orientation and the more traditional psychoanalytic and psychodynamic is our relationship not just to our sexual aggressive instincts, the drive theory, which I think is many are shifting away from or expanding out, but not only our relationship to sexual aggressive drives, but our relationship, and not only our relationship to childhood experiences or the family system or the culture, but our relationship to existence, to the cosmos as a whole. I believe that that's the fuller context within which we live and experience these crushing blows that make us feel so small or imperceptible, helpless, as well as the emboldening possibilities of a more spiritual connection. So where was I going with that? That through the therapy, I was also able to open up a kind of spiritual life that helped a lot. And then I'll just end this segment with noting that eventually led to my ability to not just intern in a psychiatric hospital, but work full time, and the graveyard shift at a psychiatric emergency center in inner city Cleveland, and a state hospital in a small town in Ohio for a year, which was quite both of those experiences were quite opening and stretching and pivotal for my sense of being able to be more present to myself and others in my work.
I mean, it sounds like a life-changing experience. And it's funny you said that about psychoanalytic, like the differences between psychoanalytic and existential ways of thinking or working, because I was thinking back to when you were talking about the APA and all these factions within psychology. And it really makes me think about how much we have to offer each other, because, one thing I'm taking from what you're saying today is there's no emphasis you have on hiding your humanity and your human struggles. And that, I'm someone who comes more from the psychoanalytic tradition, where, one way to put it, I guess, would be attempts to obscure my humanness, can be a part of the work for various reasons. And I don't think they're bad reasons, but I think there's something really, it sounds to me like your sense of your therapist's human struggles, like even if they weren't made explicit, your sense of that was an important part of what healed you or what helped you.
Question. And Anne was very human. And she disclosed some parts of her life, I feel appropriately so, that did actually embolden me to move forward, supported my exploration, personal exploration. So it was in the service of my own exploration. It wasn't indulgent kind of disclosure. But again, I felt with her like I felt with that other analyst that she had been through the wars. And in fact, I found out later that she truly had. She had very difficult times. But as a therapist, she was wonderfully solid, there for me, loving. She brought a maternal quality that was very powerful, even though my mother's maternal quality also was powerful. But my mother had some very understandable, gaps in her situation, very understandable. Utmost admiration of her pulling through losing a child. But anyway, yes, the human qualities are key. And also just thinking of parallels between kind of existential and psychoanalytic approaches, both valuing the paradoxes of the human condition, the contrasts and contradictions that we all experience, having all kinds of impulses and being open to exploring those, to staying with those, in the existential-humanistic, a little bit more emphasis on, I should say, experiencing them as distinct from talking about them or interpreting them per se, although that certainly is woven in. But I think this was one of Freud's, great gifts, was the kind of the shattering of the vanity of human beings about their own human being, especially the Victorian illusion of this sort of sanitized person, that we're so much more. And he really lifted the veil to, again, the contrasts and contradictions that we are. And being able to be having a place and a person who can work with those and who has experienced some of that tumult in their own lives and had others helping them. What greater gifts can you have if you're interested in really living a full life, or as full as you can?
I want to make sure in the time we have left that I ask you about something that you wrote that I really think speaks to the mission of the Psychotherapy Action Network, which is a piece you wrote for the American Psychologists called Toward a Science of the Heart, Romanticism and the Revival of Psychology. So in this, you write about romanticism, and here we're meaning the artistic and intellectual movement, and how the romantic perspective is increasingly absent from our approaches to psychotherapy. So can you say something about why you feel like we need, as a culture, a romantic psychology, as you call it?
Yes, and my biggest error in that article was not calling it neo-romantic, because romantic has so many connotations, and I realize it's also been connected with some pretty regressive movements through history. But I mean it much more in the sense of Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Goethe, and some of the great poets, of recognizing our creatureliness as well as our angelic spiritual nature, the great paradox of being a human. The bigger picture of living. Isaiah Berlin, fills this out beautifully in his book. I think it's called the Romanticism and Its Roots, or the Roots of Romanticism. Why we need it now? We desperately need it now. This is a very long discussion. I'll try to thumbnail it. I think Michel Foucault's thesis in Madness and Civilization is dead on about how our society made a major shift at the onset of the Industrial Revolution. But even pre-Industrial Revolution and pre-Renaissance, when we were beginning to actually move in a way of what the analysts might call a reaction formation against the disease and the pestilence and the ignorance of life in the so-called Dark Ages. And of course, the bubonic plague wiping out, I think, a third of Europe. I mean, some horrible outcomes from that era. Some of the extreme religiosity with the Crusades and the bloodletting of those times. Those times moving away from the Greco-Roman foundation that we had as well. In any case, I think he points out beautifully how we threw the baby out with the bathwater. That in our headlong leap into setting ourselves apart from the kind of chaos of the Dark Ages, we warped into a kind of hyper-sanitization and intellectualization of our lives. That did raise the standard of living, brought the Enlightenment, rationalism, with a capital R. And we gradually lost touch with our primal experience of nature. And that is tragic on many levels, individually and collectively. And I think we're still laboring under that great turn these days. And in fact, our development of tech, either consciously or unwittingly, is contributing to that movement away from our primal relationship to nature, because it is being confined, as my cousin put it beautifully, to a 4-inch screen so often in our lives, as distinct from somebody looking up and just seeing so much more that is out there and is within. Not to say that technology can't be contributory toward a fuller relationship to nature, to life. It certainly gives us access to aspects of living that we might not otherwise have. But I think we need to be careful as to, and this is what I focused on in my book, The Spirituality of All, Challenges to the Robotic Revolution, moving more and more toward not just emulating the machine model for living, speed, instant results, appearance and packaging, but actually becoming machines. That, I think, is one of my ultimate terrors, or what Kurzweil has called the singularity, the point at which the human will no longer be able to distinguish the human from the mechanical. So the issue there for our contemporary society is that the quick fix, instant result model has affected our socioeconomic system. This is what drives a lot of the model that we all live under. We want to get it done quickly, as cheaply, quickly, and sort of expediently as possible. So efficiency, with all these emphases on efficiency. Well, that has affected our entire field of psychotherapy and of psychology. And a lot of that process is very functional in today's society and compatible with the way many people lead their lives. They want, let's say, shorter term solution focused or symptom management therapy, but the question is at what price? And I think that those therapies, by the way, and this is part of my integrative approach, can be very helpful and very pivotal for many people, as I think medication can be, and I've seen it. However, treating those as the end-all and be-all of effective remedies is a great tragedy. And I think it's shortchanging, it's cheating many people, even being aware of the richer possibilities of having a fuller inner life, a richer inner life, greater contact with what deeply matters to their lives as opposed to what's efficient or rational, capital R, because the culture says it's rational and efficient. And it calls for a need to revisit the great, what I call the romantic realist tradition of Goethe and Nietzsche, many of the forebearers of actually existential and psychodynamic thinking as well. People who believe in fully facing or maximally facing the paradoxes of our lives. Again, we're very creaturely vulnerable animals who also have great possibilities to transcend limited ways of living, and that both are extremely important. These two kingdoms of the biological and the spiritual, as Thomas Mann put it, are so important to a fuller life from this neo-romantic standpoint. And being cut off from that actually may cause us, and I think has caused us, to become more chaotic and savage than would otherwise be, because of return of the repressed, and because of bitterness and resentment that people have, consciously or unconsciously, for not feeling enabled to really tap the fuller possibilities of their lives.
You know, one thing I really love about this article is that you also talk about inquiry and ways of knowing in psychology. And it's to use, you know, a word we were talking about earlier, it's a very polarizing issue in our field. For the most part, mainstream psychology focuses on experimental research, positivistic science. And you talk about, you know, the ways of knowing that can be seen as being derived from the romantic tradition. So qualitative research, the multiple case studies, linguistic analyses, personal experience, and how that can complement these, you know, experimental approaches, which is very refreshing, because I do think people tend to say, well, either the randomized control trial is absolutely no way to learn about the complexity of the human condition, or people say, you know, other ways of knowing that aren't experimental research simply aren't valid. And you take up this position. Actually, we need both. They can complement each other.
That's right.
I think that voice is really missing from the dialogue around this.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think the issue really is, what are the questions you're asking and what are the aims of the research? So if you're asking questions about areas of living or psychology that can be quantified into units of some kind, and there certainly are areas that can be quantified, and they tend to be more overt and measurable areas. They tend to be more behavioral or intellectual or intellectualizable, if you will, or cognitive. Then a more quantitative experimental approach makes sense. A more natural scientific approach makes sense. And of course, our field is imbued with natural science as its basis. And we can help a lot of people that way, and a lot of people have been helped through more programmatic, medicalized medical approaches to managing their lives and sometimes liberating their lives. But there's a vast range of people who are not really reached, I think, by that approach. And people who are met by that approach, whose therapeutic benefits do not last. Because again, they tend to be more on the external side. Something is introduced to them whether it's a medicine or it's a certain schematic, the thinking more rationally, let's say, you're restructuring things, you're reconditioning. Something is moving the person to something else in many ways. Whereas the more depth-oriented approaches, at their best, afford people the chance to really find that sense of agency within. And so people's understanding and aims for their lives come out of a real struggle and getting down and dirty with, again, what's trying to emerge within them and what's blocking them. And after that real tussle over an intensive period of time, I think many people come out with a more substantive, enduring benefit that a lot of the quantitative research doesn't particularly focus on, may not be that interested in, partly because it is so hard to quantify. However, the qualitative research can be much more amenable. Thick descriptions of people's experiences of transformation, of those fuller transformations, generally more amenable to phenomenological, hermeneutic kinds of research that specifically attempt to intimately understand the experience, the entire experience of the person, as distinct from just, let's say, overt and measurable aspects of their changes in their lives. And I think we're evolving with all of this. I think we need to keep deepening. I actually think, and I think I point out in the article, that the arts and humanities bring an even deeper phenomenological sensibility. That these are probably our greatest phenomenologists. People like Maya Angelou or Scott Fitzgerald, who can describe someone on a beach or in a city through metaphor and a very affective tonality that excavates that experience like very little in our scientific arena can. But of course, that's a great challenge. How do you translate that to a more scientific standpoint? And that's, I'm supportive of that. I mean, I see myself as a social scientist and an artist at the same time. But I do think that it's a very worthy goal to pursue some kind of amalgam of the quantitative and qualitative, and to have so many tools in our toolbox, so to speak, for the many needs to live or living. Yeah.
Well, Kirk, before we end for today, can you tell me what you're working on now? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, let's see. I'm mainly working on promoting the healing dialogues that I described to you before. I really see that as just so urgent right now. And I've been appreciative that President Biden, Vice President Harris have been calling for more of that kind of sensibility in the culture of just basic decency toward each other, basic civility. And that's where those dialogues start. And to be able to argue with one another and be on very different sides, but without killing each other, or without the argument having to devolve into the, food fight and, ultimately violence. So the more I can help with providing tools, others can provide tools to just everyday people to work with each other in these wide range of settings, the household, the community, schools, maybe work settings, definitely legislative, diplomatic settings. I think, and the more that people can cultivate presence to others and the other within themselves that gets activated by others, the more democratic and coexistent our society will be. The more we'll be able to, I think, fulfill a core vision of our democratic republic, which is to live and let live, and to really thrive from that rich diversity that we are, but to contain it too. I mean, there's obvious analogies to, our psychotherapeutic work.
Right. Well, this has been a really fascinating and really enlivening discussion today. And I thank you so much for joining me and for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching. For more information on Dr. Schneider's work, you can visit kirkjschneider.com. I also want to say the Psychotherapy Action Network is a 100% volunteer-run nonprofit, and you can learn more about our work at PsiAN.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bevin. Deeply appreciate it.